Okay, with that, Stu is not here to introduce Dr. Wertheim, so I will uh, introduce him with his bio and intros. Dr. Stephen Wertheim is a historian of the United States in the world. He directs grant strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which he co-founded with a mission to move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards vigorous diplomacy in the pursuit of peace. He is author of Tomorrow, the World, The Birth of U.S. Global Supremacy, Harvard University Press, and academic articles on such topics as U.S. strategy, international law, world organization, and humanitarian intervention. Dr. Wertheim regularly writes about current events in foreign affairs, the New York Review Book of Books, New York Times, and the Washington Post and elsewhere. Prospect magazine named him one of the world's 50 top thinkers for the COVID-19 age. He previously held faculty positions in the history departments of Columbia University and Birkbeck University of London. He received his doctorate in history from Columbia in 2015. His talk today is, how did the United States appoint itself as the world's supreme military power? Stephen Wertheim delves into the archives of the U.S. foreign policy elite to trace armed dominance to its origin in World War II. He shows how officials and intellectuals suddenly chose to embrace perpetual dominance at the price of perpetual war. And with that, Dr. Wertheim, Stephen, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Wonderful. It is my pleasure to join everybody. Thanks for inviting me to address the group. I only wish it could have been in person, but it is nice to be able to see everybody virtually in what I very much hope is the tail end of whatever it is we've just been living through. So my book tries to answer a seemingly straightforward question. Why did the United States come to adopt political and military primacy as the basic objective of its role in the world? In particular, when did it first decide to pursue global supremacy? Today, it's almost taken for granted that the United States must be number one in military power. And not only that, but to lead a system of alliances with US forces permanently stationed around the world. In the town behind me, which is Washington, D.C., when experts, officials discuss foreign policy challenges, they tend to assume US armed dominance to be a self-evident good. It's the premise from which they then debate and decide what specific policy or strategy to adopt. But as a historian, I have to think this wasn't always the case. Armed primacy wasn't a goal articulated by George Washington or John Quincy Adams or Abraham Lincoln. I think that much is uncontroversial. So at some point between then and now, American officials and intellectuals must have decided to embrace armed dominance and elevate it into a kind of axiomatic truth in our politics. Now, prior to the pandemic, I would ask audiences when they think, if they just had to apply instinct or the knowledge that they have, when the moment of rupture came. So I'll spare you of that in our virtual environment, but they gave a remarkably wide range of dates. The late 19th century, maybe 1898, World War I, any part of the 1940s, even the 1990s. So a century or more of range is quite a wide, wide one. It suggests a lack of basic understanding. What I'll argue here today is that a clear decision for dominance was made, and it occurred before the Cold War and even before the attack on Pearl Harbor put the United States into the Second World War. It happened in 1940 and 41 in the span of about 18 months. That is before the United States officially entered World War II. It was already planning to lead the post-war world even after it imagined that the Axis powers could be defeated. Now, you may be wondering, and I think you'd be fair to wonder, why there's anything new to say here. I mean, surely scholars have asked and answered my question many times before, how the United States made this decision for dominance. But I would submit that historians and political scientists have developed two distinct ways of structuring their questions and their analysis as to avoid the question, as to not quite ask how global primacy was consciously chosen. One group of scholars interprets the history as the struggle of these two forces, internationalism and isolationism. The idea is that the United States oscillated between the two before internationalism finally triumphed. The problem is this writes history backwards. It's as if certain people, the internationalists, favored American supremacy all along. And so all that needed to happen was to sweep the so-called isolationists out of the way. In fact, few self-described internationalists prior to World War II wanted the United States to be politically and militarily preeminent. What made them internationalists was something like the opposite, was their desire to transcend power politics. That's what American leaders said they wanted for most of the country's history. They hoped peaceful intercourse could supplant the reign of force. The circulation of goods, ideas, and people would give expression to the harmony assumed to be latent among nations and therefore prevent the resort to war. From this perspective, armed supremacy looked unnecessary at best and imperialistic at worst. And then the category of isolationism makes even less sense to describe any group of Americans. Almost no one throughout American history has presented themselves as an isolationist. The term is an epithet, and it's an epithet that wasn't used with any frequency before the 1930s. So it's just ahistorical to take that analytic and assume that it can actually describe anything in America's past. The term was invented in the 30s and early 40s, invented for a particular purpose, as I'll describe. Now, there's a second camp of scholars, and these are very different from the first. They dismiss isolationism as a myth, and they argue that America was always a superpower in the making. After all, didn't America expand constantly, whether driven by the material dynamics of capitalism or the ideology of exceptionalism? And maybe that's so. But if anything, this position gets us farther away from the question of how American foreign policy elites acquired the will to lead the world politically and militarily. It just assumes that, what they said they believed didn't matter. This view ignores how reluctant American policymakers were to undertake what they construed as entanglements in Europe and Asia. The United States possessed the largest economy of any nation by about 1870. It overtook the economy of the entire British Empire in the middle of World War II in terms of scale. But decade after decade, to very intelligent Americans, America's economic superiority didn't seem to imply a need for military superiority. Only a rupture, a qualitative break, would change this state of affairs. Now, that break did not come in World War I. The president, Woodrow Wilson, pitched his League of Nations as a disentangling alliance, to quote him. He said it would replace the balance of power, replace struggles for power altogether. His goal was to transcend power politics. In the name of public opinion, Woodrow Wilson repeated that it was public opinion more than armed force that would prevent the need for war in the future, and therefore for active armed policing by a supreme power. As a result, all through the 20s and 30s, supporters of the League of Nations were ambivalent as to whether armed sanctions would actually have to be used if the United States joined the League, which they advocated. It wasn't until the crises of the 1930s that the League became known widely as a collective security organization, at which point supporters of it ran from it in the United States, because for them, the whole point of it was not to go to war, to avoid having to go to war, not to enter into a vehicle to go to war. So in the 1930s, self-described internationalists in America watched fascist and communist powers rise in Europe and Asia, and they called them totalitarian powers, a label that indicated that these powers were irreconcilable with a system of American-style international law and norms. So American internationalists began to doubt the belief that had long united them, that a harmony of interest lay latent in the world that could potentially be unleashed and bring about peace. In this period, they pioneered a host of new concepts to convey the sense that armed enforcement really would be required to preserve world order. In fact, world order was one of those new phrases which began to supplant the idea of world peace. Another was isolationism. Isolationism changed the conceptual terrain. Now, I just a minute ago dismissed isolationism as an epithet, since the people that the term described almost to a man and woman insisted they were no such thing and envisioned the United States participating in the world in many other ways besides in terms of war or armed entanglements. But the label is important. It revealed something about the people who used it. Starting in the 1930s, they branded as isolationists all those opposed to armed enforcement of world order. And yet isolationism connoted something further. It suggested a desire to keep us out of everything, in the phrase of FDR's speechwriter playwright, Robert Sherwood. So for opposing the use of force, so-called isolationists accused of wanting to cut off intercourse completely with the outside world. This new concept destroyed peaceful intercourse as a viable option. It implied that, trade without force was impossible, that free interaction actually required a foundation in coercive power. So assumptions about international order were changing dramatically in the 1930s, but those changes didn't have obvious implications for American policy for most of the decade. Why should the United States be the one to supply force behind international law and order when Britain and France seemingly could do it themselves? That was President Roosevelt's position when Britain's soon-to-be ambassador, Lord Lothian, visited him early in 1939. Lothian arrived to the White House and told FDR that Anglo-Saxon civilization, in his words, needed a new guardian. The United States must now take the torch of world leadership from Great Britain. FDR wasn't having it. He mocked Lothian, got mad, and told him to toughen up. What the British need today is a good stiff grog, Roosevelt reported that he said. So the president of the United States preferred that Britain be preeminent. Let them bear the burden. And that remained the position of American policy elites broadly when war broke out. Fascists may have promised to set up a new order, but the Anglo-French alliance stood in the way and seemed superior to all challengers, even after Hitler and Stalin entered into their pact in the fall of 1939. Policymakers perceived little interest in joining the war, much less in seeking supremacy after the war, so long as Europe and Asia remained divided and Britain supreme. Consider the post-war planners who immediately got to work, inside and especially just outside the government. At the end of 1939, the State Department convened a small 11-person group that lasted just about a year. But the real action came in the Council on Foreign Relations, then about 20 years old but already an important institution. Just 2 weeks after the war began in Europe, leaders of the council went to the State Department and said, look, we know you short-staffed diplomats don't have the resources to undertake long-range planning. Let us do it for you. We'll send you our studies. We will be happy to follow your directives. And by the way, we don't need any money. We've lined up the Rockefeller Foundation to fund us. So Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles knew how to accept a good deal, and the planning began. The Council on Foreign Relations gathered a group of about 100 planners. It was a kind of image at that time of the US foreign policy elite writ small. It included the Army's top planner, General George V. Strong. It included the future CIA director, Allen Dulles. One group that did economic and financial work was headed by both America's leading Keynesian economist, Alvin Hansen of Harvard, and his neoclassical rival, Jacob Viner of Chicago. After Pearl Harbor, the council planners, many of them entered the State Department, where they formed the backbone of the department's official post-war planning operation. But until then, they were the main post-war planners in the United States, and there were many others that my book describes that were thinking along similar lines. But that's getting ahead. I want to take seriously the period of the so-called phony war from September 1939 to May of 1940. At that time, the people who had appointed themselves to plan the post-war world didn't know what they wanted. They certainly didn't want Nazi Germany to win some victory in the war, but they also feared a rapid British and French victory that might result in an exclusive Anglo-French trading bloc that could exclude the United States. Mostly, they expected another stalemate, a repeat of the last war. So post-war planners in the State Department spent most of their time trying to find ways to bring Mussolini's Italy into the side of the democracies and mediate a settlement in Europe and kind of nip the war in the bud. The one certainty was that, quote, military and political tie-ups are taboo, as the council planners put it. The United States would surely make no post-war commitments beyond the Western Hemisphere. The council had a special military group led by Allen Dulles, and I want to tell you what the group was doing in the spring of 1940 as the Nazis marched into Denmark and Norway. The group was painstakingly cataloging schemes for universal disarmament. They went all the way back to the ancient Greeks, who had prohibited poisoning wells, right up to Winston Churchill, who had suggested before World War I a one-year holiday on naval building. So they thought this was really important work to do, compiled all this stuff, and sent a memo to the State Department on May 1st, 1940, listing these various proposals for disarmament on the verge of the Nazi invasion of France. In short, post-war planners found themselves following old internationalist formula by default: promote interaction, seek disarmament, but for sure, avoid political military entanglement in Eurasia. Then the Nazis invaded France. To the surprise of everyone, including German generals, France fell within 6 weeks. It suddenly left Hitler as the master of Europe. And at that time, it seemed likely that Hitler, having seemingly mastered the art of offensive warfare, would conquer Britain and perhaps the British fleet and the British Empire. Now the American political class perceived a crisis. Congress quickly instituted the first ever draft in peacetime, and it approved a vast military buildup. But what was the crisis all about? Okay, it's not easy to explain. Few observers believe that North America faced much danger of being successfully invaded from across the Atlantic. And the US economy was so self-contained, especially after the Depression, that it just didn't need much foreign trade. America, that is, remained safe and prosperous. And that's what the post-war planners in the Council on Foreign Relations concluded. At the depths of the crisis in the summer of 1940, they assumed that henceforth, the United States might be confined just to its own hemisphere. And in fact, only what they called for a brief period of time a quarter sphere, extending from North America down to the spot where Brazil juts out into the Atlantic, and that might be it. This quarter sphere would be the area that the United States would trade in and defend militarily for the foreseeable future. And in crude material terms, there wasn't much wrong with that. The economists Hansen and Viner concluded that the US economy could perform adequately within that quarter sphere. For the same reason, some Americans believe the United States should build its military strength so it could guard the Western Hemisphere against any outside invasion that could then enable the invader to have a foothold from which it could perhaps successfully attack the United States. But that's it. It should not commit to go further. It should therefore stick to its previous commitment to non-entanglement in Europe and Asia. This was the view of a coalition of Americans who gathered under the banner of America First, a group that actually was conceived not far from where you are in New Haven. But by the autumn of 1940, as Britain withstood Germany's bombing, FDR and other foreign policy makers began to make a different choice. To them, the hemispheric existence, however adequate, was not ideal. As internationalists, yes, they wanted to avoid armed entanglement, but they also expected to be able to trade and move across the globe. And as exceptionalists, they expected the United States would define world history. This was the problem if the Axis powers were to rule Europe and Asia and even not encroach on the Western Hemisphere. And it would be the problem if another totalitarian power were ever to do the same in the future. America's territory might be safe, its economy might be sound, but it would be isolated from the world, isolated from history. FDR himself warned that if Hitler defeated Britain, America would become, quote, a lone island in a world dominated by the philosophy of force. In that situation, Americans would experience, quote, the nightmare of a people lodged in prison, handcuffed, hungry, and fed through the bars from day to day by the contemptuous, unpitying masters of other continents. Now, FDR was assuming that the United States would still be supreme in the Western Hemisphere and safe in North America, and yet he still said the United States would become a passive sufferer. It would be receiving world history, not making it. So this idea of isolation switched the goalposts. It implied that it was bad enough for the United States to be confined to the Western Hemisphere, even if secure and prosperous. It was like a direct security threat for the United States to have a hemispheric existence. Previously, internationalism, as understood in the United States, had hinged on the assumption that peaceful intercourse would transcend force, but Hitler seemed to have proved the opposite true. Intercourse depended on force. There could be no trade, no law, no order, except if defended by overwhelming force. As one of the council planners suggested, as France was falling, in new guiding principles for the group, this was America's most famous geographer, Isaiah Bowman. He wrote at the time, "We cannot relive 1919. Only force will make and keep a good peace." Let me take a few minutes to describe how the council's planners put this insight into practice. So I mentioned the quarter sphere area that was envisioned in June and July of 1940, right after France fell. In the 3 months that followed, the economists undertook a huge study at the request of the State Department to ask how much of the world did the United States really want for the future. They assumed that, as far as it could be seen, Nazi Germany would control the whole of Europe for the foreseeable future. What they sought to find was a post-war area that was economically self-sufficient, that was more self-sufficient than a projected Nazi-led Europe. That way, the United States-led group would have more bargaining power in any economic interaction with the Nazi-led group. There would also be as little governmental regimentation of trade as possible. So the only way to get rid of trade imbalances would be to make the area bigger to export surplus goods. And finally, the United States would have to take the lead in defending the whole of that area by force. So these are just out of the gate an expansive set of requirements. They allow no compromise with liberal capitalism, and they call for a superior position over Nazi Europe in a future geopolitical and geoeconomic competition. The planners started out considering a post-war sphere consisting of the whole Western Hemisphere. That actually was just the minimum of what the US political system would demand in accordance with the traditional Monroe Doctrine. So even the non-interventionists in the America First Committee were supportive of a whole hemisphere defense approach. Alas, the post-war planners found that hemisphere to be insufficient. It left South America with large trade surpluses. This was in August of 1940. So in September, the planners added a massive Pacific region, including Australia, India, and even Japan. The planners just assumed that Japan could be integrated into a US-led area, this in the same month that Japan joined the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. But even if you could somehow integrate Japan into that area, this too was deemed inadequate. It still left large surpluses of agricultural goods. Then in October of 1940, the planners added in the rest of the British Empire, including the British Isles. Thus, they wound up with essentially the whole non-German world. So the planners concluded that the United States must hold, to quote them, unquestioned power in the world, to use, quote, its military power to protect the maximum possible area of the non-German world. This plan came to be dubbed internally as the Grand Area. If there was a single first blueprint for US military supremacy, it was this. I don't want to overstate its importance. I think it was only a somewhat more rigorous display of the kind of thinking that was happening elsewhere, including in the public sphere. But it does show how rapidly America's imagined place in the world changed in the span of just 5 months. It leapt from a quarter sphere to the grand area. That's a vaster change than perhaps in the preceding half century of US foreign policy, and certainly in the next one. In the next month, the US Navy developed the first war plan that linked US security to the global balance of power and the survival of the British Empire. By the end of the year, then, American foreign policy elites glimpsed a future of US military supremacy precisely because they had lost faith in internationalism as previously understood, because peaceful interaction could no longer be trusted to overcome power politics. The United States had to keep order by force. Now, let me turn a bit to 1941. Although my book extends to 1945, I'll stop today before Pearl Harbor because I want to convey how much of America's place in the world had been conceived even before the United States formally entered the war. At the time, in fact, interventionists like the columnist Walter Lippmann repeated that the United States was in the war in all but name. The war began with FDR's For Freedom speech and the passage of Lend-Lease aid to the Allies, which clearly showed that the United States would sooner stop the Axis than it would keep out of the war, even if it was still trying to keep out of the war. And public opinion polls were very supportive of the view that the United States should sooner stop the Axis. That was a higher priority than staying out of war. With America now rearming, the United States seemed destined to define the future. Vice President Henry Wallace said, "The wisdom of our action during the first 3 years of peace will determine the course of world history for half a century." Publishing mogul Henry Luce outdid Wallace. He proclaimed a start to the American century in his famous essay by that name, and it came out already in February of 1941, well before Pearl Harbor. During the whole year, in fact, magazines and newspapers were filled with proclamations about the distant future. It seemed urgent in 1941 to articulate a long-range alternative to what the Axis powers were calling their new order for Europe and Asia. In private, post-war planners considered how to implement the American century. In particular, should the United States form an alliance with Britain or revive a universal organization like the like the League of Nations? In 1941, they gave a clear answer. Planners envisioned an exclusive American-British alliance to police the post-war world. And this is a model they defined against some general international organization. As one planner explained, the chief lesson of the previous years is that, quote, peace cannot be assured without force, force that is overwhelming and controlled by those whose self-interest will ensure its utilization. In other words, some general world body would not have the self-interest to actually police the world. Hanson Baldwin, a New York Times military analyst, led the group that sketched out bases from around the globe from which an American-British police force would operate. World order, he told the others, now required, quote, world domination by the United States and the British Empire. The planners worked to design, in their words, a policy essentially offensive in character to replace what they construed as a purely defensive one geared to guard the Western Hemisphere. This is the very same group charged with tackling military affairs that was cataloging disarmament proposals before the fall of France. Now, just a year later, even less, they were proposing a joint American-British post-war police force modeled on British imperial policing in the Middle East. At the peak of Anglophone feeling in June of 1941, some of the planners in the Council on Foreign Relations went so far as to draft out an act of Congress that would grant American citizenship to citizens of the British Commonwealth, the white settler dominions. This is not an idea that got far in Congress itself, but it reveals how much the planners at this point drew inspiration, not from some universalist scheme, but rather from the British Empire. President Roosevelt was thinking along similar lines. In August of 1941, he and Winston Churchill released the Atlantic Charter. This was the first official statement of post-war aims. Sometimes the charter appears in historical accounts as a step toward the eventual United Nations. But FDR refused to endorse any post-war organization at the time. In fact, he did so over the objections of Churchill. He explained that only America and Britain could keep peace in the post-war world. But the Atlantic Charter fell like a dead duck, the council planners concluded, as they observed the reaction in Congress and the public. They quickly perceived that their biggest obstacle lay at home. US global supremacy sounded imperialistic. It sounded somewhat un-American. It contradicted traditional ideals of internationalism. As the planners commented internally, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points had envisaged universal disarmament, at least eventually. But FDR now, in his 8 points, another name for the Atlantic Charter, promised indefinite domination by America and Britain. Even John Foster Dulles, the future Cold Warrior Secretary of State, objected to the Atlantic Charter, which he said at the time was a vision of, quote, Anglo-Saxon military and economic hegemony. So the planners worried, would the public refuse to shoulder the burdens of leadership? Now they penned a rebuke to the Atlantic Charter, mainly for its optics. The group warned the State Department a week before Pearl Harbor that, in their words, an imperialistic connotation may all too easily be given to the projected American-British policing of the seas, not only by Axis propaganda mongers, but by perfectly sincere people as well. US supremacy needed to be legitimated, that is. So beginning at the end of 1941 and continuing through 1945, foreign policy elites hit upon a solution: reclaim the mantle of internationalism. Now they positioned US military supremacy as the epitome of internationalism, as opposed to this recent coinage, isolationism. This way, armed dominance became the culmination of a tradition with roots in America's past. As the war went on, they attacked isolationism more and more, even as opposition to US participation in the war evaporated. Historians wrote new narratives that projected this dichotomy back to the very founding of the country, or certainly to the fight over the League of Nations in World War I. It was as though advocates of the same thing, internationalism, had been there all along. In addition, post-war planners, having heaped scorn on international organization for the past 2 years, now they embraced it. They realized some kind of world organization seemed essential for convincing the US public to accept world leadership, because international organization symbolized the old aspiration to end power politics. It could become a useful vehicle to allow the United States to dominate power politics. And so just after achieving victory over Japan in October of 1945, a new president, Harry Truman, could stand before the Congress and proclaim, as if it were a matter of course, to quote Truman, "We must relentlessly preserve our superiority on land and sea and in the air." Well, let me conclude with a few implications for our present moment. I think the wartime origins of American armed primacy tell us something fundamental and paradoxical about US foreign policy today. On the one hand, America's commitment to global dominance easily outlasted the Cold War competition with Soviet communism. But on the other, primacy has lost its reason for being. It's become difficult to justify. So let me take those 2 points in turn. Because the United States embraced primacy in 1940 and 41, it makes sense that it continued to do so without much of a second thought after the Cold War. Primacy had never been about the Soviet Union. It had never even hinged on a specific enemy. It was conceived as a long-term project, grounded in the argument that a decent liberal world order required armed enforcement by a supreme United States. In a world where the Nazis could come even close to superiority, some other power, sometime in the future, could do likewise. So from the middle of 1941 onward, even as American policymakers became increasingly confident that Axis power could be defeated, not just checked, but defeated decisively within Europe, they didn't say, well, this is great news. Once the war ends, the United States can go back to its former role in the world and not have forces and commitments in Europe. Instead, they expanded the grand area to include Europe, thus to include the entire world. Much the same happened in the 1990s. Soviet communism collapsed, and American leaders responded by fulfilling their aspiration for one world united under American supervision. It also helped that initially in the 1990s, the costs of pursuing armed primacy seemed low, given that any potential competitors were so weak. But something has changed in the world since the 1940s. It is the disappearance of totalitarianism as an alternative system, as a way of organizing international society and exchanges across borders. The original case for primacy depended upon the specter of an other that could expand and corrupt liberal terms of interaction. So once the fascists were defeated in World War II or the communists collapsed, who was to say some other obstructions wouldn't present themselves? It's better to nip them in the bud than to wait for trouble to brew. But today, that specter arguably doesn't exist. Communism has stayed dead. Now in China, it rose again, but only by mutating into one-party state capitalism, which is open for business on fair terms or not with the rest of the world. in this kind of a world, exactly why does the United States need to maintain military preeminence? Why shoulder the burdens, the upfront costs in lives and treasure? Why risk creating antagonisms that might even disrupt exchange and interaction? These questions now seem out in the open today in a way they weren't a decade ago. It's partly because Donald Trump ran for president and won, and he promised a different foreign policy. He didn't, in my view, oppose US military primacy, quite the contrary. He pursues what he calls peace through strength, the same theory essentially as his predecessors, based on military dominance. But Trump does make clear that US world leadership faces a crisis of legitimacy today at home. Hardly anyone believes and believed over the course of the Trump administration that he had a strategy to use power or a theory to bring peace. Armed dominance has become something like an end unto itself, which means Americans face a choice. Either they should openly espouse endless war, which the planners of military dominance understood would be the price of admission, or they should chart a different course for the rest of the 21st century. So I am very happy to leave it there and look forward to your questions, whether it's about the book itself, the history, or it's about our present moment and prospects moving forward.
Stephen, thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I'm sure we're going to have a few questions. So, gentlemen, I ask that you ask a question, and please try to refrain from making statements, and ask questions by raising your virtual hand in the participants section. And the first question we have is from Arcady.
Yes, very interesting presentation, but we see now that international landscape changed. By year of 2025. China is projected to take industrial domination in the world. And of course, they want to take over Taiwan, and usually transition of power on the globe is accompanied by the war. But now war with a nuclear weapon seems to be pretty much irrational. So how do you see what will happen with China becoming dominating force in the world?
Thank you. That is very much the question indeed. I think, the analysis of the book helps us interpret what the US reaction has been so far and where it might go. So I think there's an attempt now to essentially slot China into a similar position from the Axis powers and then Soviet-backed communism, to say, essentially, we face the same challenge, a power that is bent on something like world domination and requires, therefore, the United States to at least contain that power. But I don't know if this attempt will work, because there are significant differences between China and our 21st century setting and previous totalitarian rivals in the 20th century. One of the features that made the Axis powers and then Soviet-backed communism so disturbing for the United States, that is to say, for American foreign policymakers, was that these were understood as totalitarian powers, where, when they controlled territory, that represented effectively enclosure to the United States and to Americans. We didn't do trade, for example, with the Soviet Union. And so the nature of the system was irreconcilable with an American style set of interactions, world order, if you like. Now, China is a really interesting and somewhat different case. So the question is China like that or not? We're now talking about the world's leading trading nation, not a country that is trying to produce autarky. But then there's a difficult question of what does it mean to be entangled economically and technologically with China, given the nature of the one-party state and the ability of that state, which we've seen already, to practice coercion, if not through military force, then through economic means. The other key factor for American foreign policymakers was just outright territorial conquest. I mean, the Axis powers were bent on territorial conquest. Soviet-backed communism, a little less dramatically so, but also, proclaimed the goal of world revolution, and the Red Army menaced Europe and occupied Eastern Europe. China, to date, has walked a very different path. You mentioned Taiwan. That's obviously extremely worrying, an extremely worrying situation. But Taiwan is not like, for China, other states in its own region, let alone elsewhere. China considers Taiwan to be obviously part of China, and has never given up its claim to eventual reunification, a claim that the United States has also in principle supported. So China does not have so far the record of territorial conquest. And indeed, you might ask, why would China want the burdens of territorial conquest, want to maintain an alliance system when potentially it could get what it wants through economic initiatives, essentially. So that's, I think, maybe helps to explain why. I mean, for about 4 years now, we've seen really intense Cold War-like noises from members of both political parties in the United States. And yet a lot of that is just a performance so far. Where is the actual decoupling? I mean, if China was this fearsome, why would we be strengthening it by having such dense interactions? It doesn't look like the stock market believes that decoupling is in the offing. So I think this is an extremely interesting question, but I wouldn't take it for granted that things will turn out with respect to China like they turned out between the United States and the Axis powers and the Soviet Union.
Thank you.
Okay, then. Ed Roloff.
Dr. Wertheim, thank you. Very, very interesting. But I was wondering, how does the current political climate in the United States impact the ability of the United States to operate in the world?
Well, another profound question. You might say that if you look at even the Trump years, with all the disruption, the basic US role in the world remained pretty much intact, for all the concern that Trump would pull the United States out of alliances. He did no such thing, and even the United States added some alliance commitments over the Trump years. And he failed to end a single war, for that matter, though he put the Afghanistan war on a path to termination. So I don't know, maybe we have a system that might remain somewhat stable abroad, while it seems incredibly disruptive at home. That would seem paradoxical. But I do worry that disruption at home does impact the longevity of US commitments abroad. And I do think it's a reason to think very carefully about, to the extent the United States does not have the stable political system that it had earlier in the 20th century, doesn't that incline us toward a less of a forward military presence in the future, where, you know, one president may find himself handing off an apparatus of coercive power to a truly irresponsible person, and perhaps this time a person who actually has a plan of how to use that power, as opposed to various rhetorical gestures, as I think we saw under the previous administration.
Lloyd? Mute yourself, Lloyd.
I would like to further Ed Roloff's question about today's climate between social welfare and military. Doesn't economics play a part in this, where we have stupendous deficits, and doesn't that limit our ability to engage in international adventures?
You would think that it would. It hasn't. So that's remarkable, right? Even the guns and butter trade-offs that were perceived in the Cold War seem to be no longer perceived by folks in the town behind me. And that party is going to end at some point. We don't know when, we don't know how. And they have a point insofar as, despite all of our spending domestically and internationally, we've yet to see inflation kick in. But I wonder where the end game is. So what I really do worry about, just to take it back to America's military role in the world, I worry about a scenario where, instead of making prudent long-range choices, where the United States pulls back as a security guarantor, for example, of Europe, which is with states that are as wealthy and well off as us and can handle their own affairs in terms of security, or getting out of our morass in the Middle East and no longer over-identifying with one set of actors in the region against another set of actors in the region, having permanent friends and permanent enemies, and then getting drawn into their conflicts that don't fundamentally affect us. Instead of making prudent actions, taking prudent actions that can responsibly transition, I worry that we will face sudden crises that essentially call our bluff on the fact that we've pledged ourselves to defend about a third of the world by force against the other 2/3 of the world. So it could be over Taiwan, it could be over some of our commitments in Eastern Europe. The Ukraine crisis is a flashpoint that I hope will be resolved well, but I worry about, or it could be that the dollar ends up having a significant crisis, and suddenly difficult choices have to be made. And the fact that the United States spends year after year more than half of its discretionary federal spending on the military would present itself as an obvious source to cut. So it may be that this kind of have our cake and eat it too attitude may kind of allow us to float on for a while, but lead to something really really unfortunate down the line. My view is, let's look ahead and take responsible actions now.
Stephen, thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. Guys, if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them. If not, I want to thank you for a eye-opening, interesting presentation, and glad that you were able to come with us and be with us today. Thank you.
Well, it was absolutely my pleasure. Thanks to everybody for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Okay.
you
With
again.
that, guys, stay well, stay safe, be careful, and we'll see you next Thursday, if not sooner, at some of the activities. And have a great, great Memorial Day weekend,
Thank you. Bye.
even though it's going to rain.